we're going to share the presentation, and as I said, you will see, I think, that Gemma later on will introduce to you the Sepsis 6, but you will find out that as soon, I'm sorry, I know, I'm sorry, Gemma, but you will find that one of the second step that you will be asked to complete when you the Sepsis 6 pathway gets triggered is to take blood cultures, and this is what the presentation is mainly about. So Rebecca will present to you very briefly an audit that was done in microbiology in regards of the way we process blood cultures and what could be improved from our side in the term of timings of reporting and present to you the results. And then I will speak a bit more of a change that has been introduced in our working pattern and what implication it will have from the clinical perspective.
Okay, so this is data from 2015, 2016. So this is older data. And at that point, we were working between 8 and 8. And the blood cultures were loaded between 8 and 8. So if you took a blood culture at 9 p.m, it would be loaded the next morning. Positive cultures were taken off between 8 a.m. and 4:30. So blood cultures that came positive overnight would be waiting for you at 8 a.m. in the morning. Overnight, we had a single BMS coming in if you desperately needed them for things like CSFs. And standardly, and still standardly, you incubate a blood culture for 5 days. We put out automatic reports at 48 hours, 36 hours for paediatric cases under 1, and then you get a completely negative result at 5 days. And currently the gram stain, when your blood culture comes up positive, the do a gram stain, we call, and quite a lot of you will probably have spoken to me and my colleagues, we'll call you with the gram stain result, and then the next day we'll call you with the ID and the sensitivities. So this is what we do. This is actually a small part of what we do, but we take about 24,000 blood culture sets a year and incubate those, which obviously most blood culture sets will have 2 bottles. About 14.5% of those become positive, and we have about a 6% contamination rate. That can vary quite a lot by department, by time of year, by all kinds of things, but that's sort of roughly in keeping with what a lot of places would see, which means that when we get a positive, about 44% are actually contaminants and not so useful. But of the pathogens we isolate, these are the most common, and hopefully most of you will recognise these names. We're lucky in Wales in that we actually get very few of the kind of big, scary bugs that we would be really worried about. The reason for worrying about these is that they're often would be resistant to our sort of first-line therapies for a lot of things. So we get very little fungemia, which is great. The mortality from fungemia is terrible. We only get about 6% of our Staph aureus are MRSA. We are seeing slightly more carbapenem resistance, which obviously for those of you who work in critical care and that kind of area where you're using more meropenem for your sepsis, that would be a big worry. And about 19% of our enterococcus are VRE, which is vanc resistant. So we took some of those blood cultures, obviously not the whole set because there were so many of them, but about 3 weeks worth of blood cultures. And in that 3 weeks, we got 470 blood culture sets, 88 of which were from critical care areas, so majors in A&E, ITU, NICU, PICU, places where people are really, really sick, and we would expect to see sepsis in those groups. 50 of those became positive, 6 from critical care. And these are the Sepsis 6 audit standards, and they are quite rigorous. They're also aiming for an 100% hit rate, so quite an audit standard to achieve. And this is roughly what we do with every blood culture. So if you just look at the arrows at the bottom, you take your blood culture then gets carried to the lab. Lab receive it, put it on the machine. Then the machine incubates it for a period of time. The reason that's a blue arrow is that we can't do anything about that. We can't make it faster. If you heat it up, you kill the bugs. Doesn't make it quicker. And then once it's flagged positive, we'll take it off, we'll gram stain it, we'll culture it, we'll give it an ID, we'll give it a sensitivity, we'll put out a report for you. So looking at how we do against those standards, Luckily, we have 100% computerised data, which makes auditing all these things much easier. And this is when we take blood cultures. So I think, as you probably would expect, if there are more doctors and more nurse pracs in the hospital, there are more blood cultures being taken. So you see a disproportionate number between normal working hours and fewer overnight. This was a bit of a worry. Yeah, I don't know who was that inhalation of breath then. So yeah, so our receipt travel time, if you like, from taking it to receipt in the lab was a real worry. We sort of knew that it was quite long. We didn't quite realise how long. And the longest there is 64 hours. Which, I mean, you have to question whether you're ever going to get anything useful out of a blood culture that's been out of culture for that long. Because of the way that blood culture machines work, the quicker you get it on the machine, the better. You're trying to catch your bacteria in that growth phase. So if you leave it sitting on the lab for 64 hours, on the ward for 64 hours, it's already grown. So by the time we put it in the machine, we won't be able to tell you anything about it, even if it is growing bacteria. And the auditable standard would be for less than 4 hours. Even if you take off those top 3, which are disastrous, it's still a 10-hour travel time. So that was a big worry for us. We were receiving, and obviously there's 2 features in that. There's how long it actually takes to get from the ward to us, and then how long does it take from us to receive it to put it on the incubation machine. And we can't necessarily control things that happen before they get to the lab, but we can control things that happen in the lab. So most of our blood cultures actually were coming in between the hours that we worked, which is great, but there are some that are coming in overnight, and obviously those would not previously have got put on the machine very quickly. What you can see on here is that if once we had the blood culture, we were getting it on the machine in pretty timely fashion. Our average is about 30 minutes, which is great, the quicker the better. There's a few worrying outliers on there. And this kind of shows you those 2 together. So on average it was taking 12.5 hours from the time you take it to the time it's actually on the blood culture machine. And that should be 4 hours. So that's that first pink arrow. Then there's an incubation time, which is how long it just sits on the blood culture machine. We can't change that, that's already as fast as it can be, and the average is about 20 hours. But then this next pink arrow, we can change. This is all the processes we do when we know a blood culture is positive. So when a blood culture came positive, how long did it take us to get gram stains? Ideally, that should be less than 2 hours. Our average is 6.9 in this data. And if you look at it like this, you can see the reason for that. So this is lined up by time of day. And what this tells you is that if you're in the lab and doing work, that's great. We're doing it pretty quick. If we don't have BMSs in the lab, then it takes ages, which of course we knew. It's completely obvious. But it does show you what the stark difference is between when we have staff in and when we don't have staff in. So that was something we identified as needing a big change. And then once you've had your gram stain and you've put the put the blood on a plate, you then have to culture it for usually about 24 hours and read it. So that it's grown, so you can tell what it is, you can get sensitivity tests from it, that kind of thing. So the aim would be for that to take place within 24 hours. Our average is 27.2, which is not 24 hours, but pretty close. We would now be aiming to read a little bit earlier, so more like 18 hours of culture and then read the plates. So hopefully we will be getting those ID and SENS results within 24 hours. What this one shows you is that, again, if there's lab staff in, it's better, it's not as stark a difference, and part of that is just that there's an automatic delay while the bug grows, and that it has to grow enough for us to be able to see it, and that just takes time. So just a few other standards that they have. They are specifically for 36-hour negative results. The reason for the 36 hours is that most blood cultures that are significant will have come up within those 36 hours and flagged positive. So if your blood cultures are negative at 36 hours, it's likely that there's either going to be no growth or that it'll be a contaminant. Currently we offer that for paediatrics because that's part of their protocols. We offer 48 hours just because that's the standard protocol has been until now. But if that was particularly helpful, I think that would be changeable. Yeah. We put out final reports either when we have all the information we need, so we've worked them all up, we've got sensitivities and IDs, and if your blood culture is positive, that's usually 24 hours after the first gram stain result. We would have the result, or we'll put out a negative at 5 days to say it's finished, and we'll take the bottle off the machine at that point. We are now, because of our new computer system, able to do interim reports, so you should be able to see that things are going on. You should have a gram stain result coming up on clinical portal, and then you should have an ID and sensitivity the next day coming up, and those will be put out as we know. We will put out a report that tells you what we know. But it didn't used to be the case, but that's a relatively new change, and the IT has allowed us to do that, so people are more up to date, which is great. In conclusion, there were two big obvious delays. One was from taking cultures to getting them on the incubation, which was travel time to the lab and then loading time in the laboratory. And then there was a big wait overnight where blood cultures that had flagged positive would wait until 8 a.m. for the next day for the BMSs to come in. Federica is going to tell you what we did about that.
Yeah, so of course, there is no argument that this is suboptimal. We needed to do something to try to improve our performance towards the standards, but not just to fulfill the standards. It's because the other side of a blood culture, there's a patient with a bug getting treated with antibiotics, and we are in a phase where I believe quite often we hear actually from clinicians, they feel in between a rock and a hard place, with the sepsis campaign saying treat with antibiotic as quickly as you can, and antimicrobial stewardship, such as me, people like me who said, actually, make sure though that you tailor your antibiotics as soon as you find out what is affecting the patient. Make sure you target it. Make sure you reconsider the decision of antibiotic if you find out that actually that patient doesn't have an infection. And of course, these results, if we could optimize what we can offer and, how results are reported, that automatically should help you out in following, your sepsis pathway, but then in reviewing what you have done and see whether, de-escalation, stop of antibiotics or tailoring is an option. So the areas where we felt we could improve a bit, marginally, I suppose 30 minutes between receiver and loading up in the incubation is not a terrible time, but there's always space for improvement. But definitely we could do something about the availability of a result from a gram staining. And of course, automatically, once you take out the blood culture from the incubator, you do the gram stain and you plate it, you improve automatically. You reduce the time because you plate it, throughout. And so you reduce the time of the average time for the culture result, the final culture result, especially because, as Becky said, we are trying to see whether we could read some blood culture even quicker. And of course, in a way, indirectly, I suppose, this could improve and would improve, and this is our aim, the reaction decision make process that comes towards the end of the clinical team. So some of you might have become aware of it, although it was probably launched a bit subtly because it's still, it was a bit of a surprise to us to also be able to fill in some of the night shift rotas within our department. But from going from an on-call rota 8 to 8, we moved from the 1st of September in having a night shift rota of our biomedical scientists. So from a clinical perspective, you knew that any time of the day or the night, you could call microbiology for clinical advice. But in terms of what the lab was able to offer you, it was very limited what was on offer from 4:30 during weekdays in the afternoon and sometime from 12 o'clock during the weekends. So right now what has happened is that we have moved into a new shift rota. And this implies that we have people in the lab that will be able not only to load the incubator, but to do the gram stain, to plate and the blood cultures and to put up sensitivities. And of course, I think there are undeniable benefits from this because we would reduce the delayed time in uploading the incubators. We have already, it's just 11 days. This is the data up to yesterday, and so only 11 real days. But again, every night the average of blood culture has been put in the incubator were around 20 average per night, which, those would have been waiting either down in biochemistry, because quite often the porters dump everything in biochemistry, they don't even bring it to microbiology, or they would have been just waiting in microbiology until the following morning for a technician to come and upload them. But as undeniable benefit, once a blood culture flags positive in the incubator and we perform a gram stain, because specifically for some microorganisms, such gram-negative, some such fungi, you really would like for your patient to be on the right treatment. And of course, once you are able to plate those blood culture and you're able to to grow them and to identify them earlier in terms of what pathogen is causing what and what sensitivity is there, it would have major implication in terms of targeting the antimicrobial, making sure you're using the appropriate one, and of course in making sure we are all pursuing that sort of second stage of the start, smart and focus approach that should guide our antimicrobial usage. That is, the focusing bit, the targeting bit, and the reflection bit, I would call it, on whether your patient needs or doesn't need antibiotics. And in a different extent, because you will see what is entailed, we hope it will improve the way we deliver microbiology advice, in the way we help you managing infection. So as I said, very briefly, there have been, since the 1st of September, 2 biomedical scientists present working on a shift pattern. So what they do, they will upload the blood culture, they will blood culture is flagging up, they will gram it, and what they will do, they will put that sort of interim report into track. They would ask clinicians to refer to the clinical algorithms. Clinicians would be alerted either because they get phoned directly with the bleep number list that we have been given, or they will phone the night practitioner, who would then just communicate the result to the clinician for them to review the patient and see whether further action is needed. The clinician then will be referred to microguide. So if you are practical with microguide, which I'm sure you all are, you will find that there's a section at the bottom that is called Interpretation of Gram Results in Blood Culture. And of course, you should click there. And according to the results that is present in your interim report, in this case, it was a gram-positive query staff, you should go through this algorithm and decide whether there is further action needed, or actually you don't need to do anything, or whether, again, antibiotics, it goes down, that's just a picture, but of course, if antibiotics need to be adjusted accordingly. So far, just in the last 11 days, we had 31 gram stains released overnight, and with ID and sensitivity then plated, of course. Of these, 37.5 were gram negative. And we've seen before, gram negative, a gram negative, we would never consider it as a contaminant, really. The majority is a significant pathogen. So you see, it has an impact. This improvement in the service potentially has an impact, because we would have phoned you, told you it's a gram negative, refer you to the algorithm, and most likely, if the patient was on the right antibiotics or wasn't, you would have followed through. We know that contaminants, are present, and again, there's as Becky has presented before, part of our blood culture, up to 40%, sometimes come up with contaminant. We would argue, the blood culture technique, the way blood cultures are taken is relevant, but we understand that sometimes, this is part of the gamble. But the other thing that I think is another couple of steps that require your attention is details on the form. So 10% had no details on the form, or very big, so we couldn't phone them back. So we had a result that might have been significant, and we couldn't figure out where the patient was, under who the patient were, because there was no hospital number, with just the patient name. So again, emphasizing that it's important from our perspective to be able to provide you with a service, to have properly fill in forms. And then, although this one is debatable whether it was a lack of abilities, of practice more than abilities, from our technician in using the bleeping systems, but of course quite a few times people have been bleeped, there's never been a call back. So again, there's been insistence on that side, but quite a few calls were not returned for us to communicate a blood culture result. So this is in theory a pilot of 32 weeks in which we're going to try to figure out whether it works, whether we can keep it up in terms of the staffing issues, because we, as many other areas within the health board, we are quite short-staffed. From our perspective, I think, of course, we're going to monitor and audit it against the standards that we should comply with, but from a perspective of stewardship, we are looking into what implication it has in terms of antimicrobial choice and actions that this gram stain provide. And also in parallel, for very small areas, we are trying to pilot it during the day as well. So where we don't phone out gram stain result from microbiology, but we just tell you that there's a blood culture with a gram result, and we ask you to go through the algorithm. So these algorithms in MicroGuide are there, of course, to be to be used by you, and for us to know whether they work, what you think needs to be tweaked, how you would improve them, they make sense or not. So your feedback, again, would be extremely relevant. The future plans, though, would be to provide, gram stain interim report automatically. So for you to take somehow ownership of your your patient microbiology results, because in a way, so far, the way microbiology has worked, and free to deny it, but we, quite often blood cultures are the kind of thing that, oh, they haven't called me, so nothing is positive. There is no chasing up of what microbiology is providing you with. And the idea is that the gram stain with me will be an automatic report, with you having to go through the algorithm and decide whether the patient needs further work. And then from our perspective, then we would call you with the final ID to understand exactly what has happened to the patient in view of that gram stain, but at the same time, to help you tailoring the treatment. And we see this as a way forward, because staffing is, is an issue everywhere. And in a way, sometimes there is a feeling from our side that we are a sort of result delivering service. And I think that we would like to be more than that. We want to be there to help you treat infection. We want to be there to come and see patients with you, to engage with you, to promote better antimicrobial usages with you, to review all the bacteremias, Staph aureus bacteremias with you. And we want to be more present in the ward. And the idea is that maybe releasing some time from the gram stain, phoning out, could help in that sense as well. So help not only in having more prompt result, but also on using microbiology resources more efficiently. So as I said, we are still, 12 days after the beginning, or 13 days after we went through this change. So far, we haven't had great feedback. We don't have any feedback from the clinical team. We haven't received any specific feedback, so feel free to let microbiology know what you think about it. Of course, Dr. Rishi Dillon has been heavily involved in the implementation of the laboratory side of things, with Rachel, that is one of our technicians. From our side, all our our scientists have been happy to take a new challenge and a new working pattern to improve the delivery of our service. And the clinicians, of the piloting ward, especially during the day, but all of you actually for the night teams as well, we welcome your feedback. And I would say simply, that of course we thought we were doing good. We thought that what we were providing you with was good, but we can definitely do better. We can definitely provide you with results with a faster turnaround. That's it.